Imagine waking up in an America that just went from an isolated nation to a global superpower almost overnight. Wars, economic crashes, and revolutions in culture and technology transformed everything. But was it all progress, or were there hidden costs? Today, we're diving into APUSH Unit 7, where the U.S. took over the world. Let's get into it. Welcome, everyone, and a shout out to my video viewers. You have at least 3 places to watch or listen to the videos. I've always been on YouTube. I'm usually uploaded on Facebook, you know, where your parents and your grandparents hang out. But now I'm also able to put the video on Spotify. That's right, you've always been able to listen to me there, but now you can also watch. So here's what I want you to do so I can continue to bring you this amazing content. If I have enough followers or subscribers, I might get a few cents to cover the cost of, well, not much, but I'd love to get one of those royalty checks for 17 cents. So please follow me on Spotify or subscribe to the AP History Help YouTube channel. Okay, back to the podcast. Welcome to AP History Help. This is Wendy, your guide through the past, helping you to master AP U.S. history, one unit at a time. Today we're diving into Unit 7, covering the period from 1890 to 1945. A period that transformed America politically, socially, and economically. From the rise of imperialism to progressivism to the world wars and the Great Depression, this era is really what shaped the modern United States. Now, if you haven't already, go grab that student success planner or a notebook, because we're about to tackle some major historical themes. Continuity and change, causation, comparison, all of which are crucial to your AP exam success. Oh, speaking of that student success planner, keep listening or watching because I'm giving away one to a lucky student. More on that later. Come in, students. Class is in session. Let's start by talking about America on the world stage. Imperialism in World War I. So the 1890s marked a turning point for the United States on a global stage. After Frederick Jackson Turner declared the frontier is closed in 1890, expansionists turned their sights overseas. Economic motives, political ambitions, military strategies, thanks to Alfred T. Mahan, and racial and cultural ideology all fueled American imperialism. And the Spanish-American War, affectionately known as the Splendid Little War, due to it being over and done in less than 4 months in 1898, was sparked by the U.S. Maine explosion, but really fueled by the power of the media and yellow journalists. The U.S. fought Spain and won, and as a result gained Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Now this stoked the debate over imperialism. The Anti-Imperial League opposed expansion, arguing that it violated democratic ideas, while imperialists saw it as America's duty to civilize, and I put that in quotations, civilize other nations. So shortly after, World War I erupted overseas, further cementing U.S. involvement in global affairs. The U.S. was initially neutral, but entered the war in 1917 after the Zimmerman telegram and unrestricted submarine warfare. What was the Zimmerman telegram, you ask? Well, there was this guy named Zimmerman from Germany who wrote a telegram to Mexico. You know, Mexico, our neighbors to the south. And he basically said, hey, Mexico, if you can interrupt things for us, if you can invade the United States and distract them from possibly joining the war over here, and if you manage to win, and by the way, we'll help you, but if you manage to win, we'll make sure you get back all that land that you lost to America in the Mexican-American War, essentially the entire southwestern United States. Well, the telegram lines went through London. And of course, the Brits, who were fighting the Germans, intercepted this telegram and decoded it. How convenient. And they said, oh, really? Okay. Hey, President Roosevelt, check this out. Look what Germany's trying to do. So when that became known, President Roosevelt had a very easy time getting the United States Congress to commit to sending troops overseas to help the Allies in World War I. Now, I also mentioned unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany had U-boats or submarines. Yeah, U actually stands for Unterwater or something like that. And literally, their word for underwater sounds like underwater. So U-boats, which were submarines, and they were basically not restricting what they used them on. Although they targeted enemy ships that were thought to have weapons on board. And sometimes those ships also happened to have passengers, like the Lusitania, which the Germans sunk, and it just so happened to have 100 or so Americans on board. Oh, and yes, weapons too. Regardless, these attacks by the submarines, they were hitting just a bit too close for America's comfort. And coupled with that telegram, that is why America entered the war to help the Allies on April 6, 1917. The war introduced total war policies. This means that all parts of a nation are mobilized, including civilians, in an effort to support their country. It included the Selective Service Act, which drafted young men into service, and war bonds, which was a way to raise money for the war effort. Now, as it relates to the impact of the war on the U.S., the Espionage and Sedition Acts were passed, which limited free speech and led to Schenck versus the United States, a Supreme Court case in 1919, which ruled that speech creating a clear and present danger was not protected by the First Amendment. Now, when the war was coming to an end, President Wilson was instrumental in the talks at Versailles, leading to the Treaty of Versailles. His recommendations were called the 14 Points, which promoted self-determination and the League of Nations. France and Great Britain thought most of those points were too soft on Germany, so they didn't fly. And the U.S. Senate refused to join the League of Nations, citing the expectation of America giving up too much autonomy in its foreign relationships, and instead embracing a policy that would take it through the next couple of decades, that of isolationism. Now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's back things up a little to before World War I. Do you remember in Unit 6 when we talked about the Gilded Age? There was a lot of messed up stuff, bad working conditions, little government intervention, the rise of big business. Well, it had to end sooner or later. Enter the Progressive Era. Riding in on the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt, and even before him, the Populists. Just to trace the roots, now, William Jennings Bryan was the Populist candidate in 1896, and although he was defeated by William McKinley, McKinley was assassinated in my hometown of Buffalo, New York in 1901. And Teddy Roosevelt was his vice president and thus took over as president. Whew. So the Progressive Era spanned his presidency as well as that of Taft and the first part of Wilson. But let's not give them all the credit. The muckrakers, that being the journalists who informed the public of corruption, child labor, and the other evils of the Gilded Age, these included people like Ida Tarbell, who wrote the history of Standard Oil, Jacob Riis reporting on tenement life in How the Other Half Lives, and Upton Sinclair, who exposed the horrors of the meatpacking industry. Well, what would result was a number of changes and reforms in state and local government, as well as social areas like temperance, prohibition, and child and women labor. Teddy Roosevelt busted trusts. He regulated railroads. He signed the Pure Food and Drug Act into law. And as a lover of the outdoors, he championed conservation and protecting natural resources. President Taft continued Roosevelt's progressive policies and is credited with helping to pass the 16th Amendment, authorizing the collection of a progressive tax. All right. No, that's not the end of the podcast, but it's time for a brain break, everyone. If you can, stretch. If you are driving, do not stand up and stretch, but tense up whatever muscles you can while you still drive safely and release them. Tense them up and release them. It's sort of like a little internal stretch. And while you're exercising, got a little giveaway for you. Keep stretching or tensing and releasing. So I am always talking about that success planner. You know, I mentioned it at the beginning of every class. Well, now is your chance to get one for free. I'm giving one away. That's right. And all you need to do is navigate to the show notes and grab the link, or go into your internet browser and type, and I made this easy for you, as easy as I could. You're going to type bit.ly and then /APHH planner, all lowercase. Okay. bit.ly/APHH planner. Easy to remember. So if you go there, there's just a little survey because I want to find out who you are and where you're listening from. And not a lot of questions. I think there's like 4 questions. One of those is your name, and another is your email address, so that if you win the planner, you are going to get contacted by me so that I can send it to you. And I will contact the lucky winner on March 31st to arrange for shipping. No cost at all to you. And then you'll have it in time to spend a good month and a half with it before your AP exam. Now, back to the show. The 1920s were a time of economic prosperity, social change, and cultural clashes. The Red Scare and the Palmer Raids targeted suspected communists and anarchists. And the Immigration Act of 1924 set quotas favoring immigrants from Northern and Western Europe. The Scopes Monkey Trial in 1925 highlighted tensions between science and religion, as it tried a teacher who purposely taught about evolution to get it in front of the courts. Now, the passage of the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, transportation, and importation of alcohol, led to bootlegging and the rise of organized crime. But the economic boom was unsustainable. Investors had been buying stocks with borrowed money, interest rates were rising, there was a lack of regulation, and ultimately panic selling that led to the stock market crash of 1929, which, coupled with overproduction, bank failures, and drought in the Midwest, triggered the Great Depression. With mass unemployment, bank failures, and extreme poverty. By 1933, 25% of Americans were unemployed. A third of all the banks had failed. Stocks had lost nearly 90% of their values. And the GDP, which is the gross domestic product, it is the measure of a country's wealth and economic well-being, the GDP had fallen by 50% between 1929 and 1933. In 1932, President Franklin Roosevelt was elected. He took office in January of 1933, and he introduced the New Deal. The New Deal consisted of 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, that was the first programs intended to relieve suffering, get people food, shelter, basically provide immediate economic assistance to those most affected. Recovery aimed to revive the economy and get people back to work. And reform was meant to ensure that another Great Depression would never happen again. For example, the Social Security Act established a system of benefits for the elderly as well as unemployment insurance. The Securities and Exchange Commission regulates the stock market. FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, ensured that if a person had money in the bank and the bank failed, that their money was guaranteed. Most of these programs were literally an alphabet soup of acronyms like FHA, NRA, WPA, and more, lots more. I would suggest digging a little bit deeper into them so you have an understanding of how far-reaching FDR was in his New Deal efforts. Now, critics argued that the New Deal either did too much, as the role of government was greatly increased, or not enough, as in it didn't really stop the economic suffering. Truth be told, the Great Depression ended once World War II started, and not before that, leading to a healthy debate on the New Deal's effectiveness. By the late 1930s, tensions were rising overseas in Europe and Asia. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, began aggressively expanding and violating the Treaty of Versailles. Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, sought territorial gains, while Japan, under military rule of Hideki Tojo, expanded into China and the Pacific. The Great Depression had weakened global economies, leading many nations to embrace authoritarian regimes. The U.S. initially remained neutral, passing the Neutrality Acts to avoid entanglement in foreign conflicts. However, as the Axis aggression grew, Axis is Germany, Italy, Japan. As their aggression grew, FDR pushed for support of the Allied nations through programs like the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, and that provided military aid to Britain and the Soviet Union. And then, on December 7th, Japan's surprise attack led to the United States declaring war on them, Japan, officially entering World War II. Okay, screeching record sound effect. Was that annoying? So let's back up. This attack by Japan on Pearl Harbor was not altogether a surprise. Japan didn't just attack without cause. The U.S. had blocked them from getting oil and steel, needed materials for them to continue their industrial and imperialist goals. So as a result of their ire, they planned an attack. Now, the U.S. government expected something, but they didn't know that Japan had the technology to make the torpedoes that needed to be used in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Thus, not a total surprise, just parts of it. Now, once the U.S. declared war on Japan, Germany, in an alliance with Japan, declared war on the U.S. And to quote Bugs Bunny, this means war. Okay, I don't do voices. As in World War, a second World War. Now, the war effort transformed the U.S. economy. Federal agencies expanded, including the War Productions Board and the Office of Price Administration. Women entered the workforce, becoming affectionately known as Rosie the Riveter, and migration patterns shifted with the Second Great Migration. Now, civil liberties were restricted as FDR ordered Japanese internment by way of Executive Order 9066, which removed Japanese Americans from their homes. And that action was, in fact, upheld in Korematsu versus the United States by the Supreme Court in 1944. The D-Day invasion at Normandy on June 6, 1944, marked the beginning of the Allied liberation of Western Europe from Nazi control, with America and Britain and Canada, all of their forces storming the beaches at Normandy together. Meanwhile, the Manhattan Project, made famous by the movie Oppenheimer, was a top secret U.S. initiative from 1942 to 1945, which developed the world's first nuclear weapons. In August 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which would lead Japan to surrender on August 15, 1945, effectively ending World War II. And the bombings remain controversial as they caused immense destruction and civilian casualties while hastening the war's conclusion. Now, following World War II, the United States emerged as a global superpower, setting the stage for the Cold War. But that's another unit. You know, guys, Unit 7, it's a monster. There's so much important stuff that happens in these years, in these 55 years of Unit 7. And while it is given equal treatment with Units 3 through 8 on the exam, know your details. I skimmed the surface here. Make sure that you don't just rely on me for this content. Make sure you look into your texts or look at a couple of other sources. You are pretty much guaranteed that at least one of your free response questions is going to be from this time period. So what are your big takeaways? I'm waiting. Raise your hand. Kidding. Imperialism and World War I increased U.S. involvement in global affairs. The Roaring Twenties saw cultural and political shifts, but ended in economic disaster. The Great Depression and the New Deal transformed the role of the federal government. And World War II reshaped America's global standing and fueled post-war tensions. Okay, students, that's a wrap on Unit 7. I hope this breakdown helps you connect the dots for your APUSH exam. Now, if you want more help, comment on this episode or contact me through the website, aphistoryhelp.com. And we'll be covering Unit 8 for APUSH in 4 weeks. On March 24th is when that episode will come out. Meanwhile, the next episode of AP History Help, releasing on March 10th, will cover Unit 8 of AP World History. It's the Cold War all the way around. Can't hurt you to listen to both of them. Don't forget to follow or subscribe on YouTube and or Spotify. And remember to enter to win that AP Student Success Planner. Stay tuned, review those notes. Go ahead and give me a follow on TikTok or Instagram, or have your parents or your grandparents follow me on Facebook for quick study tips. And with that, this episode of AP History Help, it's now history.